Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss how manufacturers in particular are facing an endless series of Brexits, with new trade barriers being imposed on them like a sort of Groundhog Day, but without a cute animal or any of the humour. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So a couple of years ago, as Labour were coming out of the enforced pandemic hibernation, activists I've spoken to were saying that on the doorstep, people were saying they felt that Brexit had indeed been done. And although I talk a great deal about the detail and the ever-changing Brexit landscape, as far as most people are concerned, it meant leaving the EU, which we've done. People are generally aware it also meant leaving the single market and customs union as well, which we've done. But because most people don't actually know what the single market is or what the customs union is, or even what the EU is, they thought that that was it. Like the oft mentioned cancelling your gym membership, except in this case, although we cancelled our membership of the EU, as well as the single market and customs union, we still have to sell our goods and services there as well as buy from them. So it's not actually like leaving the gym to eat pizza in front of the telly. We still have to go to the gym, so to speak, just under different arrangements. But what people don't understand is that those arrangements keep changing, especially where access to the single market is concerned. Exporting to the single market means having to prove that the goods meet the appropriate standards. It's not enough that they do. You have to prove it, and you have to accept that the proof will be checked from time to time. But the standards keep changing. The EU is a vehicle for driving up standards, environmental standards, safety standards, performance standards, you name it. And in order to prove that your exports comply, you need the documentation. But the documentation required is not always the same. Depends to an extent on where exactly you are sending your goods, as I touched upon in yesterday's video. This week there's an article in the Financial Times which is pointing out how behind the scenes there's a very different attitude towards the EU from Rishi Sunak. This is true, and I've pointed it out myself. Instead of burning bridges with the EU, Sunak is working with them. Not to align, as Labour wants to do, not to converge, as businesses want. Sunak is still diverging the UK from the EU, but is at least doing so on friendlier terms. The way the FT describe it as constructive competition. Now, this is definitely an improvement, as I keep saying. Where Boris Johnson turned his back on the EU and marched us away, Rishi Sunak is facing them, but he's still moving away. And although friendly, pragmatic discussions with the EU are better than unpleasant name-calling, divergence under any circumstances still means problems for businesses and extra problems for businesses. In theories, those problems exist in both directions because we're supposed to begin the long delayed process of implementing standards controls on EU imports in a few months. It remains to be seen if it will actually happen as planned, but we certainly have full standards controls on our exports. And those controls are changing. They change all the time. They will constantly change. As we left the single market, our exporters basically had to comply with the standards of the EU, but the difficulty there was just proving it. After all, we had the same standards. We were only in the single market the day before. As the Tory government has lowered our standards, British producers, of course, have the option of saying, well, no, we're going to maintain our standards in order to meet the requirements of the single market. So manufacturers exporting to the EU were still fine as long as they could prove their standards were appropriate. They could still export. They just needed the costly paperwork to do it, which they didn't used to. Because this is how standards work in manufacturing the world over. It's all right, the British government going, oh, we're going to lower our standards to make us more competitive. It's like, no, you don't manufacture according to the standards of the country you're in, but the standards of the market you're selling in. But the EU standards are changing all the time. The reason the EU Parliament exists is largely to vote higher standards into their market. The big three changes being reported on at the moment are the carbon border arrangements, the plastic packaging rules, and some laws related to supply chain due diligence. Now, when we first left the single market, the pro-Brexit media, like the Daily Express, the Daily Mail and so on, they kept talking about, well, this new EU rule and that new EU rule. And I kept saying at the time, no, there are no new EU rules. These were all existing rules, rules which the UK supported, rules that have been in place for years. They're not new. They were just newly applied to us because they were rules for third countries. And I kept saying, you don't stop following EU rules by leaving the EU. You just follow different ones. Because there are rules for members and there are rules for third countries who wish to trade with them. Now, which rules do you think are the worst? The ones made by members to apply to themselves, or the ones made by members to apply to someone else, their competitors? We chose to leave behind the good rules and adopt the crap ones. But a few years has passed now. Some genuinely new rules are emerging. So manufacturers not only need to pay attention to relevant changes in the law in their own country of operation, but the EU as well, completely separate market. Now, you could argue this has sort of always been the case for those exporting to other markets as well before Brexit, but a few things. First, it's still an entirely new regulatory framework they have to keep tabs on. Second, EU standards are generally the highest in the world, so maintaining EU standards tended to work everywhere for most products, not all. And third, the UK government used to keep an eye on these things, carry out impact assessments, and then let British businesses know when they were going to be affected by some change somewhere in the world, something our current government isn't doing because it puts its fingers in its ears and closes its eyes. So British manufacturers now face a constant process of trying to track EU changes with little to no help from the government and making sure they know what to do to not only comply, but to prove they comply. Oh, and several of these new EU rules are going to affect these companies as being based in a third country. See, they wouldn't actually apply if we were still in the single market. For example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Well, what's the border? Is this national borders? No. This is EU borders, which we're now outside of. And that starts transitioning from this October with, I think it's full implementation 2026. And it applies to goods coming into the single market. It means extra costs. It will certainly mean more paperwork. Make UK, which represents manufacturers in Britain, says that it will have a major impact on British-based producers. Apparently, British MPs have been told that they really need to start tracking EU legislation in order to help British manufacturing adjust. Because obviously, we need a centralised system of monitoring changes and then producing impact assessments in order to steer UK policy so it meets the needs of our businesses. That is the job of the government and Parliament. Unfortunately, our current government is wandering around like an embittered old man muttering bloody boats, bloody banks. I don't think there's been any forward planning from our government for many years. It's not even like it would be a straightforward exercise, because as I discussed again in my previous video on Brexit, and this is going to keep coming up, it's not even like the procedure is the same for all British manufacturers exporting to the EU, because it depends where they're exporting to. Remember what I said? There are EU rules for members and EU rules for third countries. Now, the EU rules for members are made by members, so they're designed to be nice and easy, nice and comfortable. They are the harmonised rules which makes trade genuinely free within the market. Then there's the rules for third countries. The EU don't get involved in the detail of that. You sort it out yourselves. We can't be bothered. So that is left to the individual sovereign member states. So a manufacturer in Britain, a third country now, wanting to export some components to, say, Spain, will have to jump through certain hoops in order to be able to do so. And it'll be up to Spain what those hoops are. Spain are just told by the EU, you need to make sure you're maintaining these standards, right? We've got these new rules. You need to make sure these rules are followed by third countries, right? But it's up to you how you do that. So they jump through these hoops. They export to Spain. They learn this procedure. Okay, great. Next week, they need to export to Belgium, but they won't use the same procedure. They have to use the Belgian system, completely different. And the thing about these individual systems is they're all crap. And I'll tell you why. EU member states are mostly used to trading with each other in the huge European-wide single market. So when it's some minister's job to give a steer on new procedures for complying with new EU legislation for third country suppliers, they give the job to whoever pissed them off that week. The end result is usually a convoluted nightmare conceived by someone who just wants to get finished for the weekend and go home. This is what British exporters have been saying for 2.5 years now, ever since we left the single market. Not only is there a different system for exporting to each country, rather than a standard format covering the whole of the single market, but the systems are all painfully inefficient because they're cobbled together. No one really cares about them. And we chose that for ourselves and our businesses. And it keeps happening. And it's going to keep happening because the EU are never going to stop coming up with new rules, and neither are we. So until we decide to harmonise again, businesses are moderately pleased, I've no doubt, that we now have a government who is friendlier towards our major customers, but they still want one who aligns, not diverges. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.